that we are at a historic moment, really, with the situation with the Palestinians and with the situation with Israel right now. Israel has never before been so isolated, been so exposed for the country, for the state that it really is. Never before, really, has Israel been so isolated and so exposed. And this is something that we have to both thank the Palestinians for their absolutely refusal to be broken by occupation, by siege, by war. And at the same time, the solidarity movement, the wave of rage that we have seen this time around about what has happened in Gaza over the last 4 weeks. A wave of rage that has reached across the globe, including record demonstrations in the belly of the imperialist beast in America. There have been some of the biggest demonstrations in support of the Palestinians in America, which is something unprecedented. There is also other unprecedented steps, one of which just yesterday, I think it must have been, where the NUS has backed the campaign to back the Palestinians and boycotting of Israel. This is something new. This is something that is a sea change. And I think we have to welcome a sea change in terms of Israel becoming isolated, exposed. But the Palestinians have paid a heavy price, haven't they, in Gaza for this? A very heavy price. Less than 2 million people are squeezed into the prison that is Gaza, and nearly 2,000 have died. We all know the figures about children, about whole families being wiped out. One of the family members spoke to Socialist Worker this week. He's an activist in the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in Sheffield. He lost 11 members of his family on Friday when there was meant to be a ceasefire from Friday morning. And Dr. Mona, who is his sister, who lives in Gaza, has regularly spoken to Socialist Worker about her experience of treating people in hospitals which are we're still being bombarded. And I think that we have to say, here in Britain, we have a special role to play in fighting for the rights of the Palestinians. We have a Tory-run government which has, day after day after day of this bombardment of Gaza, has not broken its support for Israel. And this isn't just about now, this goes back historically. It's right behind the Israeli state. And this is the important thing, and it's why we have it as the top strap on the front page of Socialist Worker this week. Israel is a product of Western imperialism. We are not disconnected to it. It's not just something over there. It's not just something that we're fighting for solidarity for the oppressed Palestinians. It's something that was created by the ruling classes of the West to promote their interest, because they see the Middle East, not just with oil, but strategically in the world system as an important region, and they have carved it up historically and want to make sure that there is a watchdog, there is a country in there that they think they can rely on to pursue its interests, even if actually the other Arab regimes are not. Even though, let's remember, and we'll come back to this, many of the leaders of the Arab regimes play ball and happily work with the West as well. And I think that when you look at it, I mean, Cameron, only in March, Cameron went to Israel and spoke to the Parliament, and in his speech he said, "With me you have a British Prime Minister whose belief in Israel is unbreakable and whose commitment to Israel's security will always be rock solid." So no amount of civilian deaths, families wiped out, murdered children in schools, on beaches, in parks will shake Cameron's support for the Zionist Israeli state. And even yesterday we saw one of his own ministers, the first Muslim woman minister ever to serve in a British Parliament, couldn't stomach it anymore. Even though actually the ceasefire had called and the peace talks had begun, she couldn't stomach it and actually left. And I think her letter is devastating in terms of exposing the tensions among the ruling class in Britain, because actually she was being forced as a Muslim to defend the sorts of wars that have been going on, but also looking at what the Tories refused to denounce Israel, and is something she could no longer do. I have no great faith that she is suddenly going to be, standing up for the oppressed or anything else. No, let's have no illusions. She is a Tory through and through. But the fact that she had to break shows something very important, that the consensus, the pro-Zionist consensus of the ruling class in Britain, there are cracks, small but important, significant cracks appearing. You know, the fact that David Miliband, who's always saying, I'm a friend of Israel and everything else, has had to say the invasion was wrong. He doesn't say the bombardment and the air attacks are wrong, but the invasion was wrong. You know, Clegg having to say he's different. These are the sheer brutality, the sheer obscenity of what's happened to the people of Gaza in the last 4 weeks has forced some of them to actually break ranks, even just a small amount, to say that there's actually a problem with this. And I think that we have to see that the support that comes from British politicians and from the British ruling class is not just rhetorical. It isn't just words. It's very material, isn't it? Because, you know, the arms that Britain sells and promotes to Israel, people have seen the figures, more than £10 million worth of licenses agreed just in the last year, export licenses that are sold for equipment, combat aircraft, electronic warfare, you name it. And the spokesperson for the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, it's a weird sort of department to be selling arms really to a repressive regime. It said that we won't issue a license if there is a clear risk that the equipment might be used for internal repression, or if there's a clear risk that it would provoke or prolong conflict. Well, I'm sorry. What are armaments for? What's ammunition for if it's not to prolong and to provoke a conflict? Obviously, the Israelis might say, we're using your arms in order to stop the conflict because we're going to crush the Palestinians using your arms and therefore it won't go on for any longer. But the fact is, there's nobody can turn around and say there is no British arms being used or have been used in this last 4 weeks. They don't know because they're selling arms and they can't say for certain whether any of these arms have come from Britain. And I think that when you look at it, even if they start to review these export licenses, we know that repressive regimes historically have been armed by the West. They find ways around it. It doesn't actually matter about the law, though I think they should. I think we should be saying boycott, shut down, no more arms being sold to Israel. We should be demanding that, but we should be under no illusion that they'll be looking for every loophole they can to find a way to arm their attack dog in the Middle East. So one reason it's important in Britain what we do is because of our ruling class backing Israel. But let's just look at really the deeper historical reason for what it is. What have we seen over this last couple of days? We have seen what the ruling class doing the memorials and the commemorations of the beginning of the First World War. We've seen the royal family, the young royals they like to call them, because these are the trendy, hip, cutting-edge royals, putting their little poppies in what looks like will be quite a magnificent-looking art installation around the Tower of London to show how many people died. Now let's remember, no royal family died in the First World War. Who died? These royals, with their posh voices, reading little letters from working-class soldiers who were massacred at the Somme, at Passchendaele, and all of these things. Actually, this is then 100 years on. It was an imperialist war by the Western powers fighting over the spoils of the world. And we have to look at the root of Gaza. You know, they come on the news as separate things, don't they? Here's the royals planting their poppy. Here's the commitment. And then, oh, new news item. Here's Gaza. Here's what's happening. But they're not separate. These things are connected. Where did Israel come from? What was that country before? It was part of the British Empire. You know, Balfour, the Balfour Treaty, he was a British minister. You know, this began, its roots lie in the imperialist carve-up after the First World War in terms of a Zionist project. Because let's remember, Israel is not a Jewish country for Jewish people. It's a Zionist, it's a political project. Look, many Jews around the world have no time for, oppose, and have always opposed the Israeli state, because it's a Zionist state, and it's actually based on the idea that actually they have to have their own country. But I tell you what, the reason that the British and the West wanted it, because they wanted to have a country that they could rely on. And this is what Sir Ronald Storrs, who was the first British governor of Jerusalem, this is what he said that Israel could be for the British. He said, we want a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. Now, I come from Northern Ireland, and I know what they mean, because they wanted in Northern Ireland for Protestants to be the people that felt that they were attached to Britain, that really it was in the interest to stay in the British Empire, because at the time the north of Ireland was actually the heart of the British Empire, with all the industry and all the money and all the profits. Actually right now that's quite a different thing, but the fact was they wanted to hang on to it, and they wanted settlers to be the people that felt it was in their interest to stick with Britain. That's what they wanted to create with Israel. And so therefore that sense of understanding that where the drive to have a state of Israel comes from the imperialist interests of the West. And so when we look at Israel, when we look at what it does in Gaza or in the West Bank, we cannot see it as separate from the sins, if you like, of the British Empire and the British ruling class, who have blood on their hands, not just in Israel, not just in the Middle East, but we can go through the countries, can't we? Ireland, India, you name it. But that sense of historical understanding, if there's some things that we need to do as socialists and as Marxists and as activists, is not to see history as a series of disconnected events, like they tell you on the news. They're not a history of series of disconnected events. We have to look at the root causes, go back, ask more questions, because the media say, oh, we can't give the history lesson every time. But of course they always do, don't they? Because when it's the Palestinians, they always say, in response to, if the Israelis do something, it's in response to the Palestinians doing some rockets. Never the other way around. Never the Palestinians are fighting because they were dispossessed. Their villages were wiped out, people were massacred, they lost their homeland, and in 1948 they were, had a state created over their heads and made refugees for lifetime after lifetime. They never say that, do they? That would be quite easy. I've said it in 30 seconds. But of course they don't do that, do they? And so therefore, the resistance, the opposition that we've seen in Britain over the last weeks, I think has been absolutely stupendous. I really think that when you see the two demonstrations of around 100,000 people, it's hard to exactly get it right. I thought the second demonstration in London, the national one, would be smaller. I knew there was a number of demonstrations, I think including in Manchester, local demonstrations at the same time, but still more people came out. I think it's been absolutely magnificent. And I think what's also interesting, I mean, it might be better if you wanted to sit on the floor around here where it's cooler and stuff, is that actually, for the first time in a long time, we've seen many Muslim activists, whole families in some cases, coming out to march, defiant and confident, and that is what the Stop the War movement looked like when it began. And I think it's absolutely vital, and I think it's absolutely right that that many have come out to be part of this demonstrations. Because you see, one thing that was a product, was fueled by the war on terror that began in 2001, was a virulent Islamophobia in Britain. And it's still with us today, and in many ways is getting worse. And the anti-war movement, which we in the SWP have been part of since its launch, had saw the danger of the rise of racism, because the idea that it was seen as Muslims are the enemy, we saw that, and from the beginning said it was absolutely vital that Muslim organisations were part of the anti-war movement. And today we still have to resist the Islamophobic propaganda that's coming from the politicians and the media. They want us to see all Muslims as a threat. Even primary school children. Look at Birmingham. Look at the Trojan horse thing. It's an absolute disgrace. I mean, Tony Blair, we'll come back to him. Tony Blair,
please don't.
In his speech where he said, I want to bomb Syria and we should go back and bomb Iraq, not content with doing it, wants to do it again, he said, there is a problem with Islamism and extremism in the world. And he said this, he said it's a problem in the region, the Middle East, it's a problem in countries like Pakistan, etc., etc. And then in one sentence he said this, we can see from Nigeria and Boko Haram, it's a problem in African countries, and it's a problem in our own society, as we can see from the Birmingham schools. So in one sentence, he puts together Boko Haram, where hundreds of schoolgirls have been kidnapped, never to be seen again, and the Birmingham schools. Like there's a comparison. The Birmingham schools, there was what everybody now agrees was a hoax letter saying that there was a plot that was going to create young terrorists. Most of these schools are primary schools. There has been no evidence found. They put an ex-chief of counter-terrorism in charge of an investigation. The council did an investigation. Not to say there's not some problems in schools. I think any school was being investigated, especially academies, which are do your own thing sometimes. That actually, of course, but actually there was no plot. There's no plot to say that that there was some sort of extremist plot to create young terrorists in primary schools in Britain. It is Islamophobic scaremongering, scapegoating. It's a demonisation of Muslims, and we have to stand against it. And the other thing that's just started happening in the last week was the banks. I don't know if people have been aware of this, that the HSBC has been closing down the bank accounts of some Muslim organisations and institutions, including the Finsbury Park Mosque, where I was speaking only last week, near to that. And what they said was that the Finsbury Park Mosque was beyond its appetite for risk. Now, is there no, I mean, you know, you couldn't do satire now. This is from the HSBC Bank. This is after years where they created the economic crisis in terms of what was going on. And they're saying, oh, we can't, you know, this is the mosque that's been there for absolutely years and years, that it can't bank its money with the HSBC, because this isn't about loans and risk and a casino capitalism, because it's beyond its appetite. It's not about risk. These people cannot lecture us about risk when they've catapulted us into a crisis. It's about racism. And we have to, those of us non-Muslims, I think, have to absolutely stand and say we stand with our Muslim sisters and brothers, and we will not let the ruling class divide us. We will not let them demonise any section of our class and say in some way they are enemies. Because when we look at the world, when we look at who's to blame for the problems across the world, it's the Western imperialist powers that are inflicting global terror and destruction. It's the Western imperialist powers who destroyed Iraq, who paved the way for the current crisis with the growth of ISIS. It's the Western imperialist powers who bombed and occupied the impoverished population of Afghanistan. And it's the Western imperialist powers who back and arm Israel, who have done what they're doing to the people of Gaza in the last 4 weeks. And so when you look at it like that, you have to then keep looking at who's the real enemy, who's the real enemy. Now, I said about Britain and its arming of Israel. Well, you know, if you look at the biggest global power, America, it really almost pales into significance what Britain does, because were people aware that in Israel, America has $1 billion stockpile of arms, just in case, just in case they're using so much ammunition to kill families and bomb schools and hospitals that they run out. Well, they did start to run out last week. And then they put in a special request to America, saying we've run out of various things, including mortar rounds and grenades. What did America do? Oh, yeah, we happen to have the 120mm mortar rounds and the 40mm grenades you requested in the $1 billion weapons pile that we keep in your country. So please help yourselves, is what they said. Well, they didn't quite put it like that. They said, we authorise a transfer of munitions, is what they said in their document from the US Department of Defence. But doesn't that tell you something? Doesn't that tell you about the role that Israel plays for America? That they will have $1 billion stockpile of arms there, so that it can dip into it if it's using a bit too much when it's bombing people 24 hours a day. And that's what it goes on. So the very fact they use it at that tells you something about it, doesn't it? And I think that when we look at that, how can the West pretend to be doing anything other than upholding Israel, whatever it does, whatever international law it violates? When it's doing this. And so therefore, when we see the peace talks, so-called, in Cairo, it's a sick joke that John Kerry is seen to be somebody who can in any way pretend to be part of the solution when America is part of the problem. And if John Kerry is a sick joke, Tony Blair is part of these talks. Middle East peace envoy, the man who started more wars as a prime minister than anybody for many, many a decade. And the guy who did say we should bomb Syria and actually we should go back and bomb Iraq, he's been allowed to go around with his permatan, earning millions of pounds in after-dinner speeches, and then has the nerve, the gall, to strut up there into Cairo and think he's got a solution to the Middle East peace process. The guy, he has no shame, does he? He has absolutely no shame. And I think when we look at where the solution is going to come from, it isn't going to come from those talks in Cairo, because they're stitched up by the West, they're stitched up by the Israelis, and let's remember the Egyptian government right now is no friend of the Palestinians. It's an ex-general that used to be an intelligence chief for Hosni Mubarak, the dictator of decades that the revolution overthrew. So the idea that Egypt is a friend is not a friend. He is upholding the blockade. He isn't lifting the siege and could open the border at Rafah. So the only real friends the Palestinians have got are the millions of ordinary people across the region who are fighting, as well as those of us internationally who offer our solidarity. But it's when you look at the revolutions you can begin to see what the solution is. Because the Palestinians are besieged. They are split across the West Bank and Gaza, and they're also scattered in the region as refugees. There isn't a solution that they can solely fix on their own. The fate of the Palestinian liberation, if you like, is tied to the struggles of revolutions in the region. They are interlinked. Read Hossam Al-Hamalawi in the centre page spread of Socialist Worker this week. He says really our struggle against the dictators has always been linked with the struggle of the Palestinians for liberation. The two cannot be separated. And I think that sense of, when you look at those struggles, they have been fought, the revolutions for freedom and democracy, but never just within their own borders. I was lucky enough to report for Socialist Worker on a number of occasions from Cairo. I was there during the 18 days, and the Palestinian flag was flown, and I was there the day after Mubarak fell, when it was fireworks and celebrations, and it was just an amazing, amazing evening, and the flags were flying, including the Palestinian flag, and I asked two young men, what are your hopes for a new Egypt now? What do you see? And they just said, we want freedom for Palestine. He said, Israel has always had America, now Palestine will have Egypt. Now the tragedy is that the revolution is now in the grip of counter-revolution, isn't it? And as I said, the person, the military leader who claims to be now the democratic elected leader is really the counter-revolution with the facade of democracy. And they are no friend of the Palestinians. And actually, the fact is, even Morsi, Mohammed Morsi, who was the Brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood president, did not lift the siege. He didn't show himself to be a friend of the Palestinians. And therefore, that sense that actually of betrayal of Arab leader after Arab leader against the Palestinians is absolutely clear. They cannot look to other regimes, the top, at all ever, for any solution to their problem, because those regimes are constantly trying to maintain their own power. And actually, when we look at our own ruling class, we look at the West, who claim to be for freedom and democracy, but they hung on to Mubarak, didn't they, to the last possible moment. They hung on because he was one of their biggest allies, because he was also helped maintain the stability of Israel. And actually, once he went, then suddenly, Cameron dashed to Tahrir Square, didn't he, to try to be part of it. Even though, actually, what was he doing there? It was already pre-planned. He was on an arms sales tour. It wasn't a visit to celebrate the revolution. It was a visit to bring around all of these, merchants of death, which he still does. And so that sense of the idea that they're for freedom and democracy, it's a lie, it's a filthy lie, because why are they supporting Saudi Arabia? That ruling regime there. Why are they supporting the Bahraini regime? These people are dictators no less or more than the dictators of Tunisia and Egypt. So our ruling class and the other Arab leaders, it's constantly we have to see that if there isn't Arabs and they're all together fighting for liberation for the Israelis, and then there's the Western powers, because it's just like in our country, we don't identify with Cameron and our leadership. What's brilliant about our demonstrations, and when you speak to people in Gaza, they say it, it's brilliant to see there's so many people that don't agree with their British government, that don't agree with the American government. We know we have our allies. It's so important what we do, because it can be seen. And therefore, that sense of what the Egyptian regime is doing right now, it still wants to be seen as a player, but actually we know that it's far from that. It's something that is playing the game with the West to try and ensure stability and uphold Israel. That's what they've always been doing. And therefore, for us, I think we have to say, what is the solution now? Where are we going to go? Are we going to allow it to be enough to say the West imposes a shoddy little deal that means that the Gaza people will have to live under a new siege? Perhaps they'll be allowed to fish for a few more miles out to sea. Perhaps there'll be a few hours on the Rafah crossing that they'll be allowed to move some bread or some medicines. But they're already talking about they don't want to let any concrete through or cement because it could be used for tunnels. But what does Gaza need now? It needs to be rebuilt. People don't have homes. If they're not going to allow them to have the materials they need to rebuild because they're scared of them building tunnels, it means that you're saying they're going to live in tents, like so many other Palestinian generations have had to live in refugee camps. Are we going to say that's the best the Palestinians can hope for is just no air assault? Is that, is it enough just to say they've stopped the bombardment and they've physically pulled their troops out and we think that's enough? I don't think it is enough, and I don't think the Palestinians think that's enough. And I think the fact that wider audience than ever can understand the problem that these is faced for, that I think that people, more and more people now understand that liberation for the Palestinians cannot be just tiny scraps of land, perhaps with a bit of road between Gaza and the West Bank. Is that what they should be satisfied with? I don't believe they should. I believe that right now there is the potential and the possibility for fighting for something else. Because some people, when you meet them, still say, well, maybe we should have this two-state solution. There can be Israel and there can be Palestine. What two states? Number one, why should the Palestinians lose their land? But secondly, Israel doesn't want a two-state solution. Everything that was being proposed over the years, in any negotiations, they've reneged on it. They keep building illegal settlements. Everybody calls them illegal settlements, sometimes not the BBC. But there's not, the Americans won't stop them. UN proposal after UN sanction, you name it, they ignore it. They're the only nuclear power in the region. You know, there's no way that this is ever going to work. And Ghada Karmi, a Palestinian writer and activist, spoke at Marxism, the SWP's annual festival and events, and she said, I and an anti-Zionist Jew went to speak to some MPs in Parliament recently, and we basically said to them, the two-state solution is dead. There is no way forward for a two-state solution. They made it clear. They went through why. And the first hand that one of the MPs was, well, how are we going to rejuvenate the idea of a two-state solution? And she was going, but you don't get it. There isn't going to be a two-state solution. The Israelis don't want it, and actually the Palestinians won't be satisfied with it, because they're never going to get a viable state and country out of such negotiations. So we, as revolutionary socialists, say we want one Palestine where everybody can live in peace, because that's what it was like before the Zionists went in and created and carved up their state. Jews and Muslims and Christians and people of no religion lived together for centuries, and they can do again in a democratic state. That's what we're fighting for. That's the vision of what we see, and that is the vision that I think the Palestinians deserve to be able to aspire to, not to be refugees for another generations. And I think, therefore, that's a historic opportunity today in the sense of people having a vision of the Palestinians, the injustice that's been served to them over this period, that I think we need to take up. We need to take up as socialists here, which obviously means marching on Saturday in the biggest numbers as we can get, because even though there's a ceasefire, I think it will be a big, significant demonstration. I think to have that sense of saying, actually, we're not satisfied just with a ceasefire. We're not satisfied with them just sitting in Cairo, carving it up. Because do you want to come back in another 2 years, 3 years, 4 years when there's another Gaza? This is what we've been doing, isn't it? And so for me, where I want to end is, the reason that I am a revolutionary socialist is because I believe that the struggle for Palestinian liberation is linked to every other struggle. The struggle against our Tory government, who back Israel, against austerity, against what they're doing to us, because they always have money for wars. When they tell people with disabilities they've got to go without benefits, when they tell people that they can't have, you know, that food banks are only there because people don't budget properly, when they sanction people on unemployed when they're 5 minutes late for a job, you name it. Actually, these struggles are connected, aren't they? Because it's rooted in a system. When I said Israel didn't just happen, it was rooted in imperialist war and the carve-up of the Middle East by our ruling classes. These things are connected. So the only way, in the long run, that we can fight for a different world is to see that we're fighting against a system that breeds war, that breeds imperialism, that created the Zionist state of Israel. That's what we're trying to do as revolutionary socialists in the SWP. And I hope, if you want to fight for justice for the Palestinians, if you want to fight this rotten Tory government, I hope that you'll join us in that struggle and get to be a part of the SWP. Thanks very much.